Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golov, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. We serve a very broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning all industries. Next slide, please. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Ali Prof. Ali has been communicating technical knowledge for over 15 years, whether it be in the U.S. Navy, as a high school math teacher, or a writer-editor at the Boeing Company. She helps engineers and analysts write and produce their process instructions and user help in a variety of formats, including video demonstration. Without further ado, welcome Ali.
Thank you, Adam, and also to Data Conversion Labs for the opportunity to be here today. And thank you to all of you who are here listening. If you have any great technical storytelling examples, I would love it if you shared them with me. I've put my contact information here on the screen, and it will also be at the end of the presentation. You can email me, go to my website, or tweet at TechnicEclectic and use hashtag storytelling. And also, just in case you have to leave for another meeting or you're watching the replay and deciding if you want to keep watching, I'm going to start with the key takeaways. And the first one is that to create effective content, I know you need to account for many things, but if you follow the why back to the source, there's one thing that drives everything else, and that is emotions. Today's session is going to apply to all of content, words, graphics, and data, although most of my presentations are going to be just kind of words and UX. By effective, I mean content that helps users solve a problem, learn a process, or otherwise interact with your product. The reasons emotions are so important is that if you're creating content for people, and I'm going to assume that we all are, emotions are at the core of everything we do, even when we think we're being logical. And I have scientific studies later to show you. I'm really excited. Emotions are also at the foundation of memory and learning. If you want to be effective, you really need to reach your users' emotions, and the best method for doing that is through storytelling techniques. With that in mind, let's start with a brief intro, then we'll go over some of the neurocognitive research that I told you about, refresh some storytelling concepts as it applies to content, and finally go over a number of examples in use today. All right, so until just recently, I would say like 2 or 3 years ago, I believe technical writing and storytelling were on two opposite ends of the spectrum. On one hand, we have the technical communication where many of us may be today. We're talking hardcore, geeky STEM or science, technology, engineering, and math. We might be documenting software tools or computing statistical variances of big data or algorithmic computations. I mean, it's just kind of fun to say those scientific words. On the other hand, people view storytelling as airy-fairy bedtime tales or people sitting around a campfire. It's just entertainment. It's not necessarily taken very seriously. And one thing that I think is kind of interesting is that personality tests usually assign technical, logical characteristics with the color blue and creative characteristics with yellow. And interestingly enough, both Spock's and Kirk's uniform colors match the end of the spectrum they represent. Brené Brown, whose TED Talk on vulnerability is quite popular, starts her presentation with a story about how she's reluctant to call herself a storyteller instead of a researcher. She says that stories are just data with a soul, which is one of my favorite quotes ever. And she decides to combine the two and call herself a researcher storyteller. In fact, the reason I became a technical writer was due to the separation of these two topics. Growing up, I was incredibly introverted, awkward, and shy. I loved reading, and as you can see here, I did it all the time. In fact, when relatives came over to visit, my mother would drag me out of my room saying, "People are more important than books." However, as much as I love stories and creative writing, I hated doing so in school because if a teacher gave me constructive feedback on my plot or my characters, it was hard to take. My stories were so personal. As a result, I found comfort in the organization, logic, and predictability of math and science. And when it came time to graduate high school, I decided to go to the University of Washington and major in engineering. When I got to college, and I was on a Navy ROTC scholarship, so that's where I am here. When I got to college, I was so excited to find the technical communication program. This was the best of all worlds. I got to write words about math and science and help other people by explaining how to do stuff. It was awesome. But it was science writing, no storytelling at all. So, how did I become so passionate about combining the link between technical documentation and storytelling? Well, I read stuff, of course. I was researching using videos to support documentation when I came across Facebook's Just in Case Help videos. In about 1 minute, give or take, each of these videos explains some of the most boring of topics, such as changing passwords, editing posts, etc., into full story arcs, complete with a point here, click there. I'm sad to say they've taken them down, but anything on the internet lives forever, and I have links to all of these videos in this presentation, which you will be able to download afterwards. It'll be linked on the Data Conversion Labs website. I'm also interested in emotive analytics. One of the newest and most effective ways of measuring a video's effectiveness is to record a person's face and how they feel about the video. And this screenshot is just one tool out there. It's called AffDex.me by Affectiva. And as people watch the video, the graph below the video shows how people are responding to that video. Emotions and feelings, though, they kind of put me outside my comfort zone, at least in the professional sense. My definition of professional does not include the question, so how does this make you feel? Like Brené Brown, I just don't necessarily feel like it might be taken seriously enough by other people. But when you start getting into the user experience design and research and customer journey mapping, your users' feelings are very important. The more I listened and the more I learned, the more I came to realize how important emotions are and why emotions and storytelling are key to creating effective help documentation and other types of content. But I still wasn't entirely convinced, and that's where the brain research comes in. One of the first surprising things I discovered was the research on decision making. We make decisions based on emotions and then justify them with logic. And at first when I discovered that, I was like, no way. I consider the pros and cons, and I make a choice based on the pros and cons. Well, not necessarily. Antonio Damasio, he's a professor of neuroscience at the University of Southern California. He studied individuals with brain damage. If the connections between the thinking and the emotional areas of the brain have been damaged, the person can rationally process information about the pros and cons, but they're unable to make decisions because they lack any sense of how they feel about the emotions. For example, there's a patient, and we'll call him Elliot. He was a successful attorney until he went surgery to remove a tumor from his brain. This unfortunately seemed to have destroyed a part of his personality. He was formerly very energetic, and then he turned into somebody who could no longer make decisions. He was unable to write anything because he couldn't decide which pen to use. He wanted to listen to the radio, but he couldn't find a station. He wanted to tidy his desk, but he didn't know how. His IQ remained unchanged, but he was no longer able to deal with his daily routine. And then a more famous but less scientifically valid case is Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker in the late 1800s. And he was tamping with the iron that you see him holding in his hand onto some blasting powder when it accidentally discharged, and it sent the tamping iron through his skull, starting underneath his cheek and then out the top of his skull. Amazingly, he retained consciousness even on the cart ride back to town to get a doctor to help. After his accident, though, like Elliot, his personality changed and he lost much of his social and personal skills, including decision-making. Unlike Elliot, unlike Elliot, Phineas was able to reportedly regain some of his decision-making before he died 12 years later. And then there's another book, Neuro Marketing, by Patrick Renvoise. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his name. But he uses the idea of the triune brain that was described by Dr. Paul MacLean in the 1960s. So the triune brain says that there's three parts. There's a primitive or reptilian brain, the middle brain, and the new brain. Although this book is based on marketing, many of the principles have similarities with concepts we take into account as content creators and designers, and what we know about cognitive psychology. The important thing to note is that even though for the primitive or reptilian brain uses input from the other two brains. So the primitive brain is triggered by emotion. All it wants to do is relieve pain and increase comfort. It pays attention to the beginning and end of lengthy conversations, and it best understands simple languages. The middle brain is the feeling brain, and then the new brain thinks and processes rational data, and it's the last to engage. Have you ever been angry or irritated and later felt like you lost your ability to think rationally? I know I have. What do you think your users might be experiencing if they have a problem that's causing them to reference your help documentation? If they're upset enough, it might affect their ability to actually use the documentation. So one simple thing you can do is to take your users' emotions into account, and I have some more examples of this later, and speak to the primitive brain in simple visual terms. So which emotions are the most likely to affect people? This heat map study from the Harvard Business Review, it shows an aggregation of emotions from 60 people viewing the top 30 images as voted on Reddit. And what's interesting is that negative emotions were less commonly found in the highly viral content than positive emotions, but viral success was still possible when negative emotion also evoked anticipation and surprise. And so that's why I named this presentation Capturing Curiosity, because curiosity is the most powerful driver of emotion for discovering content and also sharing. Another study, however, found that the combination of, so they used three measures: valence, which is positive or negative, arousal, which is excitement or relaxation, and then dominance. You can either be in control or in submission. That also affected sharing. So things that were high arousal, low dominance. So you had a high amount of excitement, but you felt out of control. So feelings like fear got the most comments on an article, whereas the articles that had the most shares had high dominance. So you felt like you were in control. When dealing with captured content, one way of looking at it that I like to share with people is I call it information currency. And so in this view of looking at things, we have from prehistory, so information currency 1.0 is from prehistory until the Middle Ages, when everything was handwritten. Only a select few people knew how to read, let alone write. Then we had the printing press invented, and from the Middle Ages until the 1990s, the printing press evolved into very efficient machines, and I do include computers. But access to knowledge was still locked into whatever you could physically access in person, and so you were limited by how good your library was. And then the internet age changed everything. Instead of working to even find the information, the problem became the opposite, and you had too much information. And one of the things that I feel we are at today is at the 4.0. Because people have so much information at their disposal, you can find multiple versions of the same answer in an internet search. So what makes your information different than everyone else's? And the information currency today isn't just the knowledge of how to do something, it's brand loyalty and connection with the customer and with the consumer. It's all about building relationships, as evidenced by the recent rise of jobs like content marketing or brand strategist. You're trying to build feelings of trust. And the pressure is not only to be functional, but also to delight, which is also an emotion. So now we know emotions and decisions are intertwined, but what does storytelling have to do with emotions and decisions? Researchers in Spain and France discovered interesting things in people's brains when they read descriptive words and stories. People's brains behaved the same reading about the action as actually doing the action. If they read about a character who was running, the region of the reader's brain for running became active. If the character ate, the region of the brain in the reader for eating became active. So even though the reader wasn't actually running or the reader wasn't actually eating, their brain was still lighting up in that same area. If you can describe a scene or a description with enough detail, the brain engages the same as if it saw it or actually did it. Another interesting study was Yuri Hansen, who has a TED Talk. I reference a lot of TED Talks in this presentation. He took an MRI of people's brains before they heard a story and during. And what's really interesting is that when you have a group of people in a room, before, their brains were all different. During the story, their brains aligned and synced up. It even worked when the stories were told in different languages. So if somebody heard a story in English and another person heard a story in Russian or Spanish, they were still experiencing the same story because their brains were still lighting up with the characters' movements and experiences. This syncing and aligning also happened when a person repeated the story to another person. So let's say you're watching your favorite episode of a TV show, and then later you go and you tell somebody about that episode. Hey, you know, this character did this, and then this happened in the story or in the episode. As you're retelling the episode to the other person, their brain starts to align with yours. What this means for you is that through words and stories, you can create powerful brand loyalty through shared experiences. Shared stories can also be super effective for training purposes. At my work, we have an annual ethics recommitment training that always includes dramatized stories followed by open-ended discussions we discuss as a team. As we sit around the table watching the video, what I know now from all of these studies is that my coworkers' brains and mine, our brains are starting to align, which is kind of scary, but it gives context, memorability, and a shared experience. And it makes the training much more effective than if we just read a list of policies. So in the interest of time, I could bore you with a lot more scientific studies, but let's move on to some storytelling basics. We tell stories because we are human. We both think and we feel. Storytelling is as old as humanity. In a way, stories were the original help documentation, telling us how to hunt, how to parent, how to survive. And the best speakers I know, they give a point and then they elaborate with how a person did it. And in fact, TED Talks, one of the things that makes them so appealing and so informative is that over 70% of TED Talks include, of the time in TED Talks, there's like 70% that includes storytelling. So if you watch a TED Talk, you are most likely going to hear a story at least once, if not the majority of the presentation, which I think is really interesting. Sheryl Sandberg, who gave a TED Talk on the women in the workplace, she has a story about she was going to just share facts and figures and information, but instead she opened her talk with her experience of her leaving for the TED Talk, and her young daughter was clutching her leg going, "No, Mommy, don't go." And by adding that story, it made her talk become a lot more popular and get a lot more views. There's other reasons why some TED Talks get more views than others, but storytelling is one of them. Simply put, a story is when something happens to someone, and usually that someone changes. I'm going to assume you're familiar with the technical elements of storytelling, such as characters, plot, theme, narrative, etc. And if not, you can look it up later. I'm also going to assume you're familiar with the traditional story arc on the left and the hero's journey on the right. Kurt Vonnegut also even has his own theory on the shapes of stories that I encourage you to look up later. One thing to keep in mind is that stories don't have to be very long or even not detailed. They don't have to be long or involved. They can be very simple. There's an urban legend attributed to Ernest Hemingway, which is false, but if you're doing an internet search, it might help, that Ernest Hemingway supposedly, and didn't actually, win a bet that he could write a story in only 6 words. And that story, in those 6 words are, for sale, baby shoes, never worn. In fact, there's a whole website devoted to 6-word stories, 6wordstories.net, and some of them are quite creative. So you don't have to go into a lot of length in order to get a story. You can be very short in a story. In addition to story shapes, you have one person's idea for presentation shapes. I found this graphic that really captured some things well. In addition to the traditional climb to a climax in the upper left corner and the hero journey in the lower right corner, so in the upper right corner, you can tell a story where you hit a dead end, which will surprise the audience. Again, that keys into the emotions of surprise and curiosity. What's going to happen next? Then you back up and take the correct path. And that can help if you're doing help documentation. You might lead the user down the wrong path. I mean, you won't want to do this all the time, but you might say, here's the wrong path, and here's why it is wrong. It has these consequences later on. Please use the correct path, and here's how you do the correct path. The middle left, the flower-looking shape, is when you have an idea and you keep circling back to a main point. The bottom left is when you have an idea, you split out into different sub-ideas, and then you converge back to the same idea. In the center, you drop the reader into the middle of the story, then you go back in time, restart from the beginning, and then move to the future. And you might be able to think of some television episodes of some of your favorite shows, or some books that you've read, or some presentations you've heard that might be using some of these same shapes. The bottom center is telling a story within a larger story. And then the middle right is continually contrast with what is with what could be. And Nancy Duarte has an awesome TED Talk on this called The Secret Structure of Great Talks. Steve Jobs, Martin Luther King Jr., and many others use this what is with what could be shape for really effective presentations and really effective training as well. If you search storytelling on TED, and I have links in my slides, there's so many talks that are just so inspiring. Also, I was listening to a podcast interview by somebody named Ed Marsh, and he was interviewing Alisa Fox, who's the former National Society for Technical Communication, or STC president. And Alisa was sharing some of the lessons she's learned about a global content strategy initiative that her company was putting together. And one of their goals was to align the technical content with marketing content. That way, if marketing said, our product solves X problem, then TechCom had a document that matched that, and TechCom and marketing could work together. And what's really interesting to me is when Ed asked Alisa what she learned about TechCom from marketing, she replied, storytelling. She realized her company's documentation was a collection of facts, which this is my choice to impose this, the blind man and the elephant, because that's what it reminded me of. A collection of facts that don't connect is ultimately unhelpful. By having a story unify your content, even if your content doesn't include a story in the content itself, by having a story, unify your content by having a content strategy, maybe between tech comm and marketing. You know where everything fits and how it works together. And you have a sense of relationship for where things go when you create new content. When you are creating content though, and you are thinking about story, always remember that the customer or the user is the hero. He or she is struggling in the fight of good and evil, and it's all about the user doing what needs to be done and then continuing on with life. Your product and your documentation and your content are the mentors, the helpers, and the sidekick. Sometimes a hero is lucky enough to have more than one helper, and each helper has a special role. Sometimes the helper is only required for a certain situation, and other helpers are required, and sidekicks are required for the entire journey. Without you, the user wouldn't be able to transform or overcome against all odds. The one exception that I would mention is your brand story and how your company got where they are today. Brand stories are really effective, but they're kind of like Better Call Saul, or they're like Saul, is that Better Call Saul is a spin-off of Breaking Bad. So Saul is your story, your documentation, and the real user, the real character is Walter. But because you have a brand story or a brand journey, then you get your own spin-off TV show. MailChimp already gets props in my book for having a great style guide and great founding story. And now I'm really impressed with them because they journey map sending an email campaign so well that they know the sense of relief when you finally hit that send button. And what I think is kind of interesting is that giving Freddie a high five on your computer is so popular. People take pictures of themselves putting their palm to their computer screen, high-fiving Freddie, and then they post it to the internet and they share it around. So this is one example of they don't necessarily have a story in their content, but Freddie is definitely the sidekick or the helper, realizing that the user is the hero of the journey. Another company that does this very well is Intuit and TurboTax. I was fortunate to hear a presentation by Andrew Rowe on microcopy at LavaCon a few years ago. And he's the one who just kind of opened my eyes to the power of microcopy and its ability to tell a story. So microcopy is really short interface words. It's not necessarily long documentation or any sort of white paper. As a brand, they decide to go with a very friendly, informational, and supportive tone. And as they walk you through getting your information, they realize it's kind of like you don't just go on a date with a stranger and start making out with that person. Like first you have to have introductions and kind of get to know each other, and then you can go out on a date, and if things keep on going well, then you can, propose to get married and go on from there. And they realize that it's also important to reciprocate information. So when you give them an input, then they say, how do you feel about doing your taxes? And then you say, not so good. And they say, oh, we get it. The tax code is pretty crazy, but we're used to it. When they ask you when your birthday is, there's a link. You can find out why they're asking in case you feel taken aback. But they also share information. And in case you're wondering, we're turning 32 this year. That's a lot of tax returns. And so they start creating this sense of trust. They start creating and in their view, the user is on this journey of filling out the tax return, from starting out with some of the simple information to finally, you did it, you just filed your taxes, kind of the equivalent of high-fiving Freddie. And then what's also great is that if there's something that goes wrong, they make sure that they put themselves in the role of that helper, that support, that sidekick. Your federal tax return was rejected. This happens from time to time. It's telling the user it's okay, but we're here to help, and we'll walk you through updating and everything. We're here. There's another example that I haven't pictured of a lady who sat down to do her taxes, and a screen asked if either of the taxpayers had passed away, and she had to enter yes, and the date her husband passed away. The screen that came up said, "We're sorry for your loss." And that touched her so much that she posted it on social media. As a result of this decision to have a conversational tone and to include this back and forth, TurboTax, I think it was 2 years ago, they had a 104% conversion rate, a 15% unit growth for TurboTax Online, and a 2-point gain in market share, not to mention the hundreds of social shares. So even though I've shared a couple of case studies so far, the rest of this section focuses specifically on storytelling in use by various companies. And one of the ones that was the most surprising for me, and this is really great because I'm going to get to give you guys a quiz, a poll to see what you think. So there's a company called Groove HQ, and they have a blog post. And what they did is they have, so you can see on the left pane under No Story, it says Step 1, building an influencer list, and then it goes straight into the content. And so that they did an A/B test. Version A got straight into the content. There was no story. It's like, boom, here you go, building an influencer list. Same title, same everything. And then version B, they told a simple story intro, and then you can see at the bottom, it says Step 1, building an influencer list, so on and so forth. So all they did between A and B was add those couple lines of story. And I'm going to ask you 2 questions. One is, what is the difference you think between people who read to the end of the blog post, and what do you think the difference is between people staying on the page? And I will give you a spoiler alert. Readership and time on page increased, so it didn't decrease, but the question is by how much? And so Adam, this is where I will let you run the poll.
Great, thank you, Ali. Here's the first question I just launched. And this is the readership one.
All right.
And let's see, we're closing in. We're about 45, just under half the attendees have voted, and right now 43% said 100, 44, it's going up and down, so bear with me. It's okay. 46% saying 100%, 26% saying 50%, 14% saying 200%, 8% saying 250%. We're about 3/4 of the attendees voted, so we'll give it another 10 to 15 seconds, and then we'll close the poll for the first one.
All right. So we're going to do both poll questions, and then I will answer both questions on the same slide.
Okay, so I'm closing the first one, and just to give you the answers, how everyone responded, 40% responded 100%, 35% responded 50%, 13% responded 200%, 8% responded 250%, and 5% responded 300%.
Okay, we'll see who's right. Let's do the second poll.
And the second one I just launched.
All right, so how much do you think time on page increased between No Story and Story? So when you told just that little story at the beginning, how much longer do you think people spent on the page?
We'll give it a couple more seconds. We're just about 65% of the attendees voting.
All right. That's great. It's hard to get people involved in a webinar, and I'm really glad that I'm able to do this and that people are responding.
We'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close it now.
All right.
And here's how the attendees answered. 31% answered 200%. 26% answered 100%. 23% answered 300%. 13% answered 500+%, and 8% answered 400%.
All right. So let's see. So I have this slide that had the test answers. Here are the results. So for the full page readers, with no story, there were a certain amount of people who read to the very bottom of the post. That number increased by 296%, almost 300% of people, more people read to the end of the blog post when there was a brief story at the beginning. And the time on page was over 500%. And when I saw those stats, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. I have to include this in my presentation. And I'm just so glad that I found this before the presentation, not after, because I just wanted to share. I didn't realize just how powerful stories were. And I do have a blog. It's kind of on hiatus while I've been doing a couple of things. But I can definitely, I'm going to start taking some of my own advice and figuring out how I can incorporate some of these storytelling techniques into my blog posts. And even though I think I'm doing my user a favor by getting straight into the information, maybe if I can add just a little bit snippet before. Now, keep in mind, these are blog posts. This isn't necessarily help documentation. Or if you're in a very highly regulated industry like the medical industry or the financial industry, you don't necessarily want to be adding little stories at the beginning of your documentation, especially if it's like warning or compliance or regulatory. And I do have some more examples about how you can still use storytelling techniques in those industries. And I also, if you read the Groove HQ storytelling and content marketing blog post, which I do have linked in my slides, that again we'll post to the page after the show or after the webinar. The author, Alex, offers 5 suggestions, and he says, you know, you can, if you want to kind of get some more involvement with your readers in your post, you can include snippets of dialogue, you can use some fictional scenarios, you can add tiny vivid details here and there. Again, that's causing the area in your brain to light up as if you were actually seeing it or actually doing it. You can tap into stories that people already know, pop culture, historical reference. So at the beginning of this presentation, I used Captain Kirk and Spock. And so that's kind of tapping into some of the pop culture about Spock and Kirk. And so I use that in this presentation. You can also use the power of visuals and like stills from TV shows and memes. And what I found really interesting is that when he talks about images, he even says, and this is a direct quote, the images don't necessarily have to do anything with the subject of your story as long as they convey the emotion you're trying to get across. So he has an example where he's talking about looking himself in the mirror, and he posts, again, Breaking Bad, he posts a picture of Walter White looking at himself in the mirror, kind of splashing his face after he's done shaving, and then looking at himself and really staring at himself intently. And Walter White and Breaking Bad, they have nothing to do with the subject of his blog post, but it's that emotion of really looking at yourself and critiquing yourself that's why he chose to use that image. It also tapped into pop culture. All right, so then another thing that's really fun, and I'm not going to actually play this video today, is the Deloitte recruitment video. And so the first segment is 30 seconds long, and it's a first-person point of view video that follows you as a new employee. And it's done first-person point of view where you're looking at your hands. So there's a scene where you glance at your watch and see what time it is, and then you pay for coffee, and it shows your hands giving change to the coffee barista and picking up coffee. And then you go into this elevator, and you open your coffee, and you sneeze. And as you sneeze, some of your coffee spills onto the jacket of this person in front of you. And then the video stops, and it asks you, what do you want to do? He didn't notice it. He didn't turn around. As far as he knows, nothing happened. So do you tell him, do you rub it in, and do you keep quiet? And what's really interesting is this is just the beginning of kind of a choose-your-own-adventure type story that leads you through the Deloitte culture values that they that they want you to have. And so if you tell him, if you pick tell him, then it's like, yes, we value honesty, and then it goes on from there. And if you pick rub it in, then it kind of says, oh, that's not a value that we like, or keep quiet, you know, that's not a value we like. And so then the story ends and you can try again. It was really creative, and wouldn't it be fun to use this as a journey map to some help documentation, which is also my next example. But you could create a customer experience journey, and every point where there's a decision tree, you could go out and do a decision and say, okay, well, the user could either do this or this or this. The other interesting thing is that the video, which I don't have this in the screenshot, but because it's first person and you're using the hands, and another interesting thing is we're primed from birth to notice hands, and it's why whiteboard videos are so effective. So if you're doing a video and you have a whiteboard video with a hand, that's really effective. First person, and putting it in first person, again, your user is the hero, and it really involves you. So also in the idea of choose your own adventure storytelling, I found a blog post by Panzon Consulting. There's a lady who runs this out of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and she presented one post on the technical reasons for using structured content. But what's really cool about this post is that she talks about dynamic storytelling and how you can specifically use structured content to anticipate multiple stories at the same time. And she gives 3 different examples. So in her first example, she talks about curated website content. So let's say you are the American Society of Civil Engineers, and you have all of this content curated about flooding and mudslides and bridge collapses and earthquakes and things like that. When an event happens, you want to be able to quickly assemble and adapt content for those specific natural events. And so she goes through, you know, without structured content, with structured content. And then in situation number 2, you have an editorial where you're working on a city park project, and you want to be able to go through the various sites and the various construction stages, and without structured content, you have to manually write everything hard-coded, but with structured content, you can tag things, and then you can aggregate them, rotate through various sites, and you can have a much more dynamic kind of where are you going type of journey. And the same thing with, let's say you're at some sort of scientific department at a college university, and you have a careers in science section. And so by using structured content, you can create dynamic lists that adjust to different paths. So if you are interested in doing the kind of choose your own adventure like Deloitte did, but for help documentation, you might have also heard of Mark Baker's Every Page is Page 1, where people enter your content documentation from many different points. And so you don't really have a first page like you used to have with a book, is that no matter where they enter, every page is page 1. And if you, after the webinar, if you go to Panzon, this storytelling, she explains some ways in which you can use structured content to accomplish that dynamic storytelling. Also, just last month at the time of this webinar, it's going to be recorded, but that would have been May 2017, I was very fortunate enough to go to the Society for Technical Communication, or STC Summit, and I attended a session on journey mapping by Michelle Gardner. And it was so informative, thinking about so if you're in one of those highly regulated industries, your content may not actually have a story, but if you take your user persona and you put them on a journey and how they interact with your content, one of the 2 things that I thought was really interesting is that one of the top 2 things on her slides were thoughts and feelings, and I recreated them for myself. She gave a situation where Lorelei Gilmore from the Gilmore Girls wants to go get coffee, and how she differentiates from other coffee drinkers, and then what she does. And so the action is taking place. So you get to the coffee shop, what happens? What are her thoughts? What are her feelings? And then there's other things that go on. But I just thought it was so so interesting that thoughts and feelings were up there at the top. Also, if you search the internet for customer journey mapping, you'll find tons of great examples. There are some simple, some that are more involved, but many of them will and should, if they don't, include thoughts and feelings. As your customers interact with your product and your documentation, remember the neuroscience behind decision making. Feelings power every decision, and then we justify that decision with logic. So just to kind of wrap up some of the key takeaways, to kind of review where we've been, storytelling connects our users to us. And that's really important because we want them connected to us in Information 4.0. We want them to have that brand loyalty, to have that connection, to choose us above other people. And then use that emotion to drive the decision, which then is justified with logic. And then that emotional connection is the new currency. And I'd like to leave you with this quote, which I found really kind of introspective, and that's, "Perhaps we share stories in much the same spirit that explorers share maps, hoping to speed each other's journey, but knowing the journey we make will be our own." And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention today. I hope you found this presentation interesting and informative, and it might not change the way you go back and do your job today or next week, but I believe that technical storytelling is going to be a huge game changer for all of us in the content industry in the coming years. Please feel free to contact me now or after the presentation. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Ali. A very informative webinar indeed. Folks, just want to remind you, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat area. The first question that's come through, Ali, is how do you match up the usefulness of telling stories with the need for short, simple, searchable answers to user questions?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, so there are a couple of things at play. And so the usefulness, there's going to be the qualitative as well as the quantitative. And so when you're looking for the usefulness, you really want to know who your user is. And you'll know if your user is somebody who's younger trying to program the TV remote, it's just like, get me in, get me out, get me done. Or if there's somebody who might be a little bit older. Anne Handley, she's a content marketer, and she's been doing this really great initiative. Her new idea is slower marketing, where you actually take storytelling and you slow down your marketing and get people more engaged. So that would be part of the qualitative part. How do you know if it's valuable or not? Hopefully you've done your user research well, your user persona well, and you know if that's something that your user will value or not. The second is you might have some metrics like the Groove HQ blog post where you have time on page, length of readership. Let's see. So I talk about emotive analytics, and you can try to, if you want to try and start using those, that's not commonly used today. Depending on your content, there's different ways in which you can do some A/B tests and do your own Groove HQ A/B test to see which is more effective. And I'm sorry, I got distracted. What was the last part of the question?
Sorry about that, Ali. I was on mute. The last part of the question is with the need for short, simple, searchable answers to your user questions.
Oh, okay. And so that brings, thank you. For the short searchable part, that brings me back to the Panzon Consulting, where she uses structured authoring with, so even though it's a story, you can tag it with emotions, you can tag it with content tags. So like, this is a story about this feature of my documentation, and it's going to be, like maybe you might have a series, let's say you're Microsoft and you're talking about Microsoft Excel. And there's some things about Excel that not many people know about, but when they do find out about it, they say, oh my goodness, that's a great shortcut. Why didn't I know about this earlier? So you might have a campaign to get people more aware of some of these less used features. And so you might tag a content, an article, some words, or some video. You might content with surprise or time saver or relief, and you might also content with or tag it with your typical content tags, such as hidden feature, which isn't the best term, or something like that. I hope that answered your question, and if not, please feel free to contact me as well.
Great, thank you, Ali. The next question that has come in is, are there different approaches needed when serving highly specialized technical users versus more mainstream consumers?
And I would say both yes and no. No, because we are all people. And one of the things that I've learned in my journey about how important technical storytelling is that we, as people, we feel first and then we think. And whether you're a technical specialized user or a general audience viewer, you're still having emotions, you're still having feelings, and those are still affecting your thoughts. And so you want to address those emotions and address those feelings, no matter if they're a technical person or a general person. Your actual way that you go about it, in your example, you want to match your user. So if you have a sample story, so for instance, you have a feature, and then you have like a sidebar that says, you know, here's Ernie the engineer, and he's doing his job, and so on and so forth. Or like I gave the example of my ethics training, is that the recommitment training, they try to use actors and scenarios. In fact, what's really interesting is that, so we have an office environment and then a factory environment, and they actually split out to two different types of videos. They have the same ethics subjects, but they have videos for factory workers in the factory setting, and then they have videos for office workers in the office setting, so that way we can identify more with the people. So with the general audience, it's more difficult, I believe, because you're trying to reach more people, or you might have multiple personas you're trying to reach. Whereas if you have a more technical audience, you have less personas that you're trying to reach, and you have sometimes better information about who that persona is, what matters to them, what they might be thinking, and what they might be feeling when you do your customer journey map.
Excellent, Ali. Thank you so much for that. Folks, that is all the questions we received today. So we'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version of this webinar starting tomorrow in the webinar archive section of our website, located at www.dclab.com. Also, our next webinar will be Thursday, June 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, titled Uncovering the Power of Visual Storytelling, presented by Rachel Amesbury of Shorthand. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you.